September 1945. The Atsugi Air Base, located on the Kanto Plain, sits under a heavy, humid shroud of silence that feels alien to the men who once called it home. For years, this tarmac vibrated with the roar of Sakae engines and the frantic energy of ground crews prepping Zeros for their final, desperate sorties. Now, the wind merely whistles through hangar doors left slightly ajar, carrying the scent of salt air and charred rubber. Inside one of these cavernous structures, a group of elite Imperial Japanese naval aviators stands motionless. Their flight suits are frayed, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a lost cause, and their eyes are fixed upon a strange, stubby blue object sitting on a pedestal. It is the Link Trainer, a flight simulator that looks more like a child's toy than a weapon of war. The senior pilot, a veteran of Midway and the Philippine Sea, steps forward. He expects to see a crude mock-up, perhaps a static wooden frame used for basic cockpit familiarization. Throughout the war, the Japanese philosophy of pilot training was rooted in the spirit of the warrior. It was a brutal, physical process. To fly was to be in the sky, feeling the G-forces pull at the blood in one's veins, smelling the oil, and risking death with every banking turn. There was no substitute for the air. The idea that a machine sitting on a concrete floor could teach a man the soul of flight seemed like an American fantasy, a symptom of a soft culture that relied on gadgets because it lacked the stomach for true sacrifice. But as the American technician flips a switch, a low, rhythmic hum fills the hangar. It is the sound of vacuum bellows breathing like a mechanical lung. The electric humming begins, a steady, unwavering drone that signifies a power that does not tire, does not hunger, and does not fear. The Japanese pilots watch in stunned silence as the stubby blue fuselage begins to pitch and roll with a fluid, uncanny grace. It moves with a precision that mirrors the physics of the atmosphere, reacting to invisible inputs with the cold logic of mathematics. To these men, who had seen their comrades fall in flames because of a single miscalculation in the heat of battle, the sight of this machine is haunting. The sensory details of the hangar intensify the moment. The smell of ozone from the electric motors mixes with the dampness of the concrete floor. One pilot reaches out to touch the side of the trainer, expecting the vibration of a struggling engine, but finds only the smooth, cool pulse of American industrial perfection. This is not a toy. It is a portal into a world where the Americans had mastered the sky before they ever left the ground. The Japanese airmen had been told that the Americans were decadent and weak, yet here was evidence of a civilization that had automated the very essence of experience. In this cramped, oscillating cockpit, the veteran pilots catch their first glimpse of why the Pacific had turned into a graveyard for the rising sun. The hum of the machine is not just a sound. It is the heartbeat of a nation that had replaced the individual's desperation with the collective's calculation. The air of the hangar grows heavy with the realization that their war was not fought against men alone, but against an inexorable tide of logic and abundance. To understand why the sight of a blue wooden box on bellows could strike such a blow to the Japanese psyche, one must look back to the years preceding the conflict. The Imperial Japanese Navy had cultivated the most rigorous pilot training program in the world. It was a Darwinian crucible where thousands applied, but only a handful of the eagles survived to earn their wings. The Japanese doctrine was built on the foundation of Seishin, martial spirit. In the 1930s, trainees at Chuchiura were subjected to a regime that prioritized physical endurance and instinctive mastery. They were expected to live the flight, to feel the vibration of the airframe as an extension of their own nervous system. There was no room for artificiality. The Japanese viewed the sky as a sacred arena where only those willing to embrace death could truly master life. To them, the American approach of using mechanical aids and classroom theory was seen as a lack of warrior resolve. They believed that by shielding their students from the dangers of the cockpit, the Americans were producing paper pilots who would crumble when the first tracer rounds streaked past their canopy. However, The reality of the war revealed a devastating flaw in this philosophy of individual brilliance. As the conflict ground into 1943 and 1944, the electric humming of American industry began to drown out the screams of the samurai. While Japan relied on a shrinking pool of veteran masters, the United States was utilizing the link trainer to create a production line of competent, disciplined aviators. By late 1944, the Japanese training program had collapsed under the weight of fuel shortages and the relentless attrition of their best men. New recruits were being sent into the sky with barely 30 hours of flight time. Men who had never mastered the basics of navigation or gunnery, sent to die in a desperate attempt to stem the tide. In contrast, the Americans were graduating pilots with hundreds of hours of experience, much of it gained safely on the ground within the rhythmic, bellows-driven pulse of the simulator. The link trainer was more than a machine. It was the embodiment of a democratic approach to warfare. It suggested that excellence could be taught to the many, rather than being the exclusive domain of a gifted few. For the Japanese observers at Atsugi, the historical weight of this realization is immense. They begin to see that their reliance on the exceptional individual was their undoing. The Americans did not need every pilot to be a legend. They simply needed every pilot to be proficient, backed by a system that valued the preservation of its human capital. As the simulator pitches forward in the dim light of the hangar, it represents the shift from the age of the hero to the age of the technician. The electric humming serves as a reminder that the Americans had turned the chaotic art of dogfighting into a repeatable industrial process. This moment at Atsugi captures the collision of two eras, one that viewed war as a test of the soul, and another that viewed it as a problem of engineering. The Japanese pilots, standing in the shadows of their own obsolete Zeros, start to comprehend that they weren't just outfought, they were outthought by a nation that had learned to simulate the heavens. Sub-Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, a man who had survived the infernos of Rabaul and the desperate scuffles over Truck Lagoon, steps closer to the device with a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. In his mind, the American adversary was a creature of comfort, a pilot who relied on high-octane fuel and heavy armor because he lacked the spiritual fortitude to face a foe in a nimble, unarmored machine. Tanaka had spent years honing his sixth sense, that mystical connection between the pilot's will and the aircraft's trajectory. He expected the Americans to be clumsy, perhaps even fearful, without the crutch of their superior engines. He had anticipated that their training tools would be as soft and indulgent as their rations. Instead, as he peers into the cockpit of the link trainer, he is confronted by an array of glowing dials and precision instruments that suggest a terrifyingly high level of competence. The contrast is visceral. In the Japanese flight schools, instrument flying was often treated as a secondary skill, something to be used only when the warrior's eye was obscured by clouds. But here, the cockpit is designed for blind flying, the ability to navigate and fight entirely through the interpretation of data. Tanaka notices the turn and bank indicator, the vertical speed indicator, and the radio compass, all arranged with a logical efficiency that mocks the improvised nature of his own late-war cockpit. The electric humming of the simulator's internal vacuum system vibrates against his palms, a steady reminder that this machine does not rely on the fickleness of human adrenaline. It is a cold, calculated environment. The expectation of American weakness evaporates, replaced by a chilling realization. The Americans were not avoiding the danger of the sky out of fear, but were mastering its most difficult aspects in an environment of total control. This emotional shift is devastating for a man like Tanaka. He had been taught that the American reliance on technology was a sign of decadence, yet he now sees it as a sign of immense intellectual and industrial power. The simulator represents a culture that values the brain as much as the heart, and the machine as much as the man. As the blue box tilts sharply to simulate a stall, Tanaka watches the instruments respond with a fidelity that matches his most harrowing memories of actual combat. He begins to understand that while he was relying on the vanishing traditions of the samurai, His enemies were building a future where the sky was no longer a mystery, but a laboratory. The shock is not just technical, it is spiritual. The electric humming becomes a requiem for the ideology of the lone ace, replaced by the relentless, humming progress of a nation that had learned to conquer the heavens through the sheer force of its abundance and its logic. The mechanical reality of the link trainer was a masterclass in American ingenuity, a complex web of vacuum bellows, valves, and electrical relays that functioned with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. To the Japanese aviators watching, it was a miracle of engineering that bypassed the need for high-octane fuel, a resource that had become more precious than gold in the dying months of the Japanese Empire. While Japanese students were being grounded because there was no oil to lubricate their engines, the Americans were logging thousands of hours in these trainers, powered by nothing more than a standard electrical outlet. The device utilized a set of 4 pneumatic bellows to simulate the pitching, rolling, and yawing of an aircraft in flight. A vacuum pump, driven by an electric motor, created the pressure differentials necessary to tilt the cockpit in response to the pilot's movement of the stick and rudder pedals. This was the source of the electric humming, a sound that signified the frictionless transition from theory to practice. Inside the trainer's base, a teledeltos paper recorder, often referred to as the crab, tracked every movement of the simulator across a desk, providing an objective, undeniable record of the pilot's performance. In the Japanese tradition, a pilot's mistakes were often corrected with a strike to the head or a stern lecture on lack of spirit. In the American system, the mistake was printed on a piece of paper. The data did not care about a pilot's lineage or his willingness to die. It only cared about his ability to maintain a heading and an altitude. This mechanical honesty was a revelation. The Japanese had struggled with the concept of blind flying, often becoming spatially disoriented when entering thick cloud banks over the Pacific. The link trainer, however, was specifically designed to teach the 1-2-3 system of instrument flight, allowing American pilots to fly through weather that would have grounded the entire Imperial fleet. The sophistication extended to the simulation of radio signals. An instructor sitting at the external desk could broadcast simulated Morse code A and end signals to the pilot, mimicking the complexities of the radio range navigation system. This meant that an American pilot could learn to find a carrier in a storm without ever leaving the safety of a hangar in Kansas. For the Japanese veterans at Atsugi, the technical prowess of the simulator was a physical manifestation of a gap they could never bridge. They realized that the Americans had managed to capture the invisible forces of the atmosphere, wind, lift, and drag, and house them inside a blue wooden box. The risk-free mastery afforded by this technology meant that by the time an American pilot reached the cockpit of a Hellcat, he was already a veteran of 1,000 simulated storms. The electric humming was the sound of a nation that had solved the problem of human error through the application of mechanical perfection, ensuring that their warriors were prepared not by the whims of fate, but by the certainty of design. In the dim, cavernous stillness of the hangar, the recurring electric humming takes on the quality of a religious chant, a rhythmic vibration that seems to emanate from the very bedrock of the American spirit. To the Japanese aviators, this sound is the ultimate symbol of American abundance and the democratic machine. In Japan, every bolt, every drop of oil, and every scrap of aluminum was a precious commodity, extracted through national sacrifice and the austerity of an empire under siege. A machine that consumed electricity and mechanical ware just to provide a practice experience was, in their eyes, an almost offensive display of wealth. It represented a society so teeming with resources that it could afford to simulate reality 1,000,000 times over before ever engaging with it. The humming motor of the link trainer was the sound of a factory that never slept, of a power grid that spanned a continent, and of a people who viewed technology not as a luxury, but as a fundamental right of their fighting men. This symbolism of the humming machine stands in stark contrast to the silence of the Japanese war effort. By 1945, the Japanese military was a silent one. Engines were silenced by lack of fuel, and voices were silenced by the finality of the kamikaze dive. The electric humming represents the noisy, bustling vitality of a democracy that solves problems through industrial output. It is the sound of a system that trusts its citizens with expensive, complex tools, believing that the investment in a single life is worth the cost of the machine. While the Japanese airmen were expected to be the cogs in a spiritual engine, the Americans had built literal engines to protect their men. The sound fills the hangar at Atsugi, drowning out the ghosts of the old Bushido code. It is a persistent, unwavering reminder that the Americans did not just bring more guns to the fight, they brought a different philosophy of existence, one where abundance was a weapon and the preservation of the individual was the highest form of military efficiency. For the observers, the humming becomes a metaphor for the inevitability of their defeat. They realize that they were fighting a ghost in the machine, an opponent that could replicate its best pilots through vacuum tubes and pneumatic bellows. The electric humming signifies a world where the sun never sets on the assembly line. It is the sound of the future, a mechanical heartbeat that promises a life of ease and precision to those who embrace its logic. As the pilots stand before the blue trainer, the sound vibrates in their chests, a physical manifestation of a power they can finally name, the overwhelming, automated grace of a free people who have harnessed the lightning. The machine does not shout or boast. It simply hums, a steady, confident drone that tells the defeated that their era of blood and bone has been superseded by an era of steel and current. This is the ultimate expression of American democracy, a machine that works for the man, ensuring that the light of freedom is backed by the hum of the infinite. The psychological disintegration of the divine wind ideology begins in the presence of this blue, vibrating box. For the men standing in the Atsugi hangar, the concept of the kamikaze had been the ultimate expression of spiritual superiority, a belief that the purity of a pilot's sacrifice could overcome any material disadvantage. They had been indoctrinated to believe that the American pilot, pampered by technology and fearful of death, would eventually falter when faced with a warrior who had already accepted his end. The special attack units were born from the desperate hope that human will could serve as the final guidance system for a falling bomb. But as they watched the link trainer simulate complex maneuvers without risking a single hair on a pilot's head, that ideology begins to crumble. They realized that while they were training their youth to die for the emperor, the Americans were training their youth to live and conquer through science. The realization is a cold, drenching rain on the embers of their fanaticism. To the Japanese command, a pilot was a consumable resource, a spark of spirit to be extinguished for a moment of glory. To the Americans, the pilot was a precious asset to be refined, protected, and returned to the fight. The link trainer allowed a student to crash 1,000 times in a simulated cockpit, learning from every mistake, until his survival was no longer a matter of luck, but of calculated proficiency. This preservation of life was not a sign of American cowardice. It was the ultimate strategic advantage. The Japanese pilots see that their divine wind was a gust of desperation, while the American electric humming was a steady, unstoppable gale of progress. The machine in front of them proves that the Americans didn't fear the sky. They had simply mastered it so thoroughly that death was no longer its primary requirement. This shift in perception is a total ideological collapse. The veteran aviators look at their own hands, scarred and calloused from years of brutal manual combat, and then at the smooth ergonomic controls of the simulator. They see a future where the warrior is not a martyr, but a technician of freedom. The electric humming signifies a culture that values the human mind enough to build a mechanical shell to protect it. The Japanese pilots, who were prepared to plunge into the sea in a blaze of fire, are forced to confront the fact that their sacrifice was rendered obsolete by a society that preferred to invest in its people. The ideology of the divine wind required a dead hero. The ideology of the link trainer produced a living veteran. As the trainer's motor continues its steady drone, the silence of the Japanese pilots becomes a profound acknowledgement of a lost world. They had fought for a past rooted in blood, only to be defeated by a future powered by the hum of the machine. The factual records of the Pacific Air War are written in a grim arithmetic of loss, but in the presence of the link trainer, those numbers finally begin to make sense to the Japanese veterans. During the height of the conflict, the Imperial Japanese Navy tracked its pilot survival rates with a growing sense of dread, noting that while their elite veterans could hold their own, the newer batches of volunteers were being cleared from the skies in mere minutes. At Atsugi, the Japanese airmen are allowed to witness a demonstration of the trainer's crab recorder in action. As a pilot inside the cockpit attempts to execute a precision instrument approach, the mechanical arm on the desk outside traces a perfect, ink-lined path across the map. It is a visual representation of data-driven mastery. The Japanese pilots, who had always relied on the feel of the wind and the visual horizon, are forced to confront the reality that their manual instincts are often fallible. The recorder shows no emotion, it only shows the truth of the flight path. The data reveals the immense gap in training hours that defined the latter half of the war. By 1944, a typical American ensign arriving at the front had logged over 300 hours of flight time, a significant portion of which was dedicated to the grueling, repetitive precision of the link trainer. In contrast, Japanese records showed that their trainee pilots were lucky to receive 40 hours of airtime, much of it spent in aging biplane trainers with barely enough fuel to circle the airfield. The electric humming of the simulator was the sound of those hundreds of hours being banked in safety. The Japanese pilots realized that the Americans were not inherently more talented, they were simply more practiced. Every simulated stall, every practiced recovery, and every hour spent staring at the artificial horizon had built a muscle memory that the Japanese spirit could not replicate. The evidence is laid bare on the desk, a series of clean geometric lines representing the American pilot's ability to navigate through the dark, contrasted against the jagged, desperate maneuvers of the Japanese experience. This integration of data and machine-guided precision highlights a fundamental difference in military intelligence. The Japanese had recorded the deaths of their pilots as noble sacrifices, but the Americans recorded the errors of their students as data points for improvement. The link trainer allowed the United States to turn the chaotic medium of the air into a controlled, measurable environment. For the observers at Atsugi, the sight of the crab recorder moving with robotic certainty is more terrifying than a squadron of Hellcats. It represents a system that has conquered the fog of war through the meticulous application of records and feedback. They see that the war was not a series of heroic duels, but a massive exercise in quality control. The electric humming signifies the relentless processing of information, a machine that takes in raw recruits and outputs disciplined, surviving aviators. The Japanese airmen stand silent as they realize that while they were writing poetry about falling cherry blossoms, the Americans were using ink and paper to map out the most efficient way to stay alive and win. The contrast between the resource-starved Japanese empire and the American machine is nowhere more evident than in the simple, constant flow of electricity required to keep the trainer alive. By 1945, the Japanese home islands were a landscape of scarcity. Factories were silent for want of coal, and cities were plunged into darkness to save what little power remained for the radar arrays that scanned for the next B-29 raid. To a Japanese pilot, an engine was a temperamental god that required a sacrificial offering of rare oils and high-octane spirit just to cough into life for a few hours. Yet, here stood the link trainer, drawing a continuous stream of power from a grid that, to their shock, remained robust and functional. The electric humming was the sound of a civilization that had moved past the struggle for survival and into the luxury of refinement. It represented an abundance so vast that the Americans could afford to waste energy on a flight that never left the ground, simply to ensure that their men were better prepared for the one that did. This abundance extended to the very construction of the device. The Japanese had seen their own aircraft production falter as they resorted to using wood and canvas for structural components, attempting to save precious duralumin for the front lines. They looked at the link trainer, a machine primarily made of wood, vacuum bellows, and complex electronic switches, and saw not a makeshift substitute, but a sophisticated instrument of pedagogy. The Americans were not using wood because they lacked metal. They were using it because it was the most efficient material for a pneumatic simulator. Every component was clean, well-maintained, and seemingly replaceable. To the Japanese aviators, who had seen their ground crews cannibalizing wrecked planes for spare parts under the light of hand-drawn lanterns, the American logistics chain seemed supernatural. The simulator was a physical manifestation of a supply line that stretched across the Pacific, fueled by a homeland that was not just untouched by the war, but was actually flourishing because of it. The electric humming serves as a sonic reminder of this industrial disparity. It is the sound of 1,000 power plants and 1,000,000 assembly lines. While the Japanese had focused on the aesthetic beauty of the Zero and the spiritual purity of the pilot, the Americans had focused on the scalability of the training process. The abundance of the United States was not just in its bombs or its fuel, but in its ability to create these sanctuaries of learning. The Japanese pilots stand in the hangar at Atsugi and realize that they were not just fighting a military, but an economy that had weaponized its own prosperity. The simulator's hum tells them that for every pilot they shot down, the Americans had 10 more waiting in the wings, each one having spent more time in the rhythmic pulse of the link trainer than the Japanese students had spent in the air. The realization is a bitter one. The Americans were winning because they could afford to be smart, while the Japanese were losing because they could only afford to be brave. The transformation of the Japanese aviator's worldview is finalized in the quiet hum of that Atsugi hangar. It is a moment of profound, silent conversion. For years, these men had been the high priests of a cult of the air, believing that the cockpit was a shrine where only the most spiritually pure could perform the miracles required for victory. They had viewed the war as a collision of wills, a contest to see which nation possessed the harder heart and the sharper blade. But as they watched the American instructor step out of the link trainer with a casual smile, they realized the war was never what they thought it was. It was not a struggle of spirit against spirit. It was a struggle of a dying past against an inevitable future. The transformation is absolute. The electric humming has replaced the war cry. They see now that their empire's defeat was not a failure of courage, but a failure of imagination. They had prepared for a crusade, while the Americans had prepared for a curriculum. The pilots begin to look at their own history through a new, harsher lens. They recall the frantic, improvised training sessions in the final months of 1944, where young boys were taught just enough to point a plane at a ship and close their eyes. They realize that this desperation was not a sign of strength, but a confession of bankruptcy. In contrast, the link trainer represented a nation so confident in its methods that it could turn the mastery of the sky into a repeatable, boring, and safe routine. The Japanese realization is that the war was lost in the laboratory and the classroom long before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor. The Americans had won because they understood that the most powerful weapon in the world was not a bomb, but a well-trained, surviving human being supported by a machine that could simulate the infinite. This ideological shift moves from the military to the civil. The pilots start to understand that the electric humming is the sound of a world they want to be a part of. The machine does not discriminate based on rank or birth. It responds only to the correct input, to the logic of the dials. It is a democratic machine. The Japanese airmen, who had lived under the shadow of a rigid feudal hierarchy, see in the simulator a glimpse of a society where progress is available to anyone who can master the tools. The transformation is poignant. They no longer look at the Americans with the eyes of enemies, but with the eyes of students. The hum of the motor becomes a bridge between the wreckage of their old lives and the possibility of a new Japan, one built on the same principles of science, abundance, and the preservation of life that the link trainer so perfectly embodied. The link trainer stands today as a silent harbinger of the modern age, a blue wooden monument to the moment the world shifted its axis. In the epilogue of the Great War, It remains the ultimate proof that the preservation of life through technology is the highest expression of a civilization's strength. For the Japanese pilots who stood at Atsugi, the machine was a mirror reflecting the obsolescence of a world built on the glorification of death. It revealed that the true victory of American democracy lay not in the weight of its bombs, but in the depth of its classrooms and the precision of its simulators. The electric humming did not just signal the end of a conflict. It announced the birth of a new era where the human spirit would be augmented rather than consumed by the machine. This mechanical pulse represents a larger truth about freedom and progress, that a society which values the individual will always outlast one that views its people as fuel for a divine fire. The Link trainer proved that mastery of the heavens is not a gift for the chosen few, but a science available to the many. It linked the survival of the pilot to the success of the mission, creating a cycle of experience and improvement that spanned continents. As the last of the veteran aviators walked away from the hangar, they carried with them the understanding that abundance is not just a matter of factories and fuel, but a state of mind that chooses to invest in the future. The humming has never truly stopped. It lives on in every flight that finds its way home through the storm, a steady, rhythmic reminder that the light of human progress is best guarded by the tools of reason. In the final analysis, the war was won by the nation that learned to simulate the impossible, ensuring that when its children finally reached for the stars, they did so with the confidence of those who had already been there, guided by the unwavering, democratic hum of the infinite.